All right, we had no one else speaking on this. Questions by members of the council? Motion. Mr. Johnston, second?
No.
Second?
Second, and you're going to take a look at whether it makes sense to have some sort of an additional exhibit or some other way to, I think, provide some guidance.
We'll examine what we could prepare.
Yeah, you'll examine that.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Okay. Is that a yes? Second?
Yes, I'll yes.
Second, Mr. Natoli. All right, comments, questions, members, starting with Mr. Johnston.
Gray, aye.
Okay, Eisenberg, aye.
Totally aye.
Okay, we got 4-0, one abstention. Mr. Fiorini had to step out for a telephone call. Let's give him the right to add on to the roll when he returns with your permission. Okay, if you would turn now, please, page 7, ERP4, floodplain, riparian habitats, levee projects. Mr. Ray.
Yes. This is a policy that also has been part of the Delta Plan for many editions and recognizes the benefit of setting back levees and incorporating other measures that would enhance the value of the shoreline area, particularly to provide migratory corridors for fish and wildlife along the rivers. And the regulation is required, and the regulatory policy is required, that levee projects have to evaluate and, where feasible, incorporate alternatives, including the use of setback levees, to increase floodplains and riparian habitats. And one of the things that the fiscal and economic impact analysis that we did as part of the rulemaking package revealed was that this was an action that was particularly responsible for the costs that we could forecast of the Delta Plan's implementation. So out of concern for those costs, trying to examine what the alternatives might be to make that not such a burden, we realized that if only we had the criteria that the Delta Plan asks the Department of Water Resources and others to prepare about where levees could be set back, it would help us narrow the focus for this policy and so relieve many areas of the cost, particularly of evaluating whether it's feasible to set back levees. What we've done is consult with the fisheries agencies and identified those waterways that have the highest priority for enhancement along the shorelines to improve habitat for anadromous fish. These would primarily be the Sacramento River, downstream from Sacramento, including the distributaries at Steamboat and Sutter Sloughs, and the San Joaquin River from the Delta's southern boundary down to Mossdale, and then the north and south forks of the McCollum River. And this would include urban levees in West Sacramento and Sacramento. And so we've tried to narrow the application of this policy in a way that doesn't require folks who are in areas that don't have a near-term prospect for creating particularly significant contributions to these salmon and steelhead migratory corridors, to relieve them of the financial burden of studying the feasibility of setting back levees. There may be other things they can do in those areas to incorporate riparian vegetation or do other things in a levee improvement, but we're not going to ask them to do full evaluations of the feasibility of setting back levees, and we hope that will reduce the cost of implementing the program and being more responsive to their concerns. Now, we still could, if you wanted, that's our recommendation, is that we focus it on that particular area, and we've got a map of what those channels would be. Yeah,
members, this is the draft map on it's attachment 2,
yeah,
with some comments in boxes
yeah.
around. I borrowed Mr. Ray's magnifying glass yesterday in an attempt to read the notations on this map without notable success, but that just may be my problem.
Mm-hmm.
Can I, Mr. Ray, one question. I didn't understand why Paradise Cut area is in orange and what that implied.
Oh, you may have
on the map.
Yeah, you may have identified something that I didn't catch.
The box comment implies that it might provide opportunities for setback levees, but I was unclear whether it is included within the revised language you're proposing.
Is Eric Nichols still here? Eric, it was your intention, right?
I just didn't understand.
Yeah, just the point of that color distinction was something that came together early on when I was developing the map. It was just to highlight that that was under consideration for bypass expansion as well.
For flood bypass.
Yes.
And so that area is included in the designated area to require the study of potential setback
Yes.
levies?
Yes.
Okay, that was not clear.
Yeah, and my apologies for that. I was just trying to highlight it so folks
Were-
internally, when we were having our early discussions, knew that it was also under consideration for
Were
bypass.
you in an orange mood when you did it?
Presumably.
Yes. Mr. Natoli.
Yeah. Question I have is that I think obviously this begins to narrow down some of the, and so I appreciate the staff's look at trying to narrow the focus, but particularly in the upper part of the map here, you start putting the additives of what's, because this references the BDCP document, the additives for the area between Freeport and Walnut Grove. When you look at the potential for what's being proposed as a conveyance project, and then you start putting setback levees and muck ponds and forebays. I mean, the footprint of that begins to really speak more to potential of water transfer and habitat creation. And I guess my question is that what about the equation of the towns, the people, and all that? That because that area has any number of potential impacts, and DWR is going to do a study. Well, DWR is actually doing other things as well, including approaching landowners so that they can do the reconnaissance on potential conveyance and intakes and everything else. That just seems like that's, again, recognize that maybe where the habitat corridors are. That is really, I think it's just another layer, recognizing this may be a separate effort. It may have its own merit because of habitat and so forth. But when you start layering that all on, at some point, using a point that Melinda made a little earlier on another matter, is that you start, the cumulative becomes pretty big. And that's what I guess I point out. So I'm not saying this is inaccurate in the sense that it may have been identified. But my point is, Dan, is that in the more cumulative context, if certain things come to pass, those are major impacts. And again, I'm very familiar with, setback levies and, the Safeco project and what you do and the size of those levies and so forth and their corridors. But, you've got not just towns, but you've got residential, because folks typically have had their domiciles and their residences and businesses closer to the levees because that's been the higher ground and some of those island areas and so forth. I mean, there are some potentially big impacts. And again, we're not weighing that out for the purpose of this document, but this becomes another guidance, and we adopt a map that then helps point the finger, even more directly at certain areas. And so I guess my question is that was that a thought or consideration in that you've got habitat restoration areas, you've got the BDCP conveyance piece of it, and then you've got the overlay of now setback levies.
Yeah. Well, I guess the structural, we talked earlier about the structural relationship of the BDCP to the Delta Plan itself. So I think in suggesting these areas, we were trying to identify those locations that would provide the best habitat for fish, and the fisheries agencies are giving us advice just like they're giving the Department of Water Resources as it develops the BDCP.
Right.
Another advantage here is that most of these areas, other than on the McCollum, are project levies, and so the burden of doing these feasibility studies wouldn't fall so greatly on the local agencies. Another way that we've looked at this has been in the instructions that you've given us and the way we've framed up the kind of review we're going to do on the BDCP. One of the things we thought that would be of particular interest to the council was reviewing the project's impacts on the Delta as a place and trying to be especially attentive to those issues. So I think that's another way in which we're trying to do that. I think at this particular time, because of the structural relationship between the two, we're trying to focus on the immediate responsibilities we have for the Delta Plan that's before us. And when the BDCP, and if the BDCP is approved and if it is upheld on appeal, then we'll have to look at that. But the first question right now is let's think about where we're at today and then be prepared to deal with the adequacy of the environmental document and the ways it proposes to address those kind of issues. Certainly there would be social reasons in some locations along these stretches of river where I think you would not want to set back levees because there's historic structures immediately adjacent to them that would require disruption or other things.
So just let me finish the question out then. So is it consistent that DWR, who is overseeing the conduct of the BDCP, or at least a party, major party to that, and would be doing any project, any likelihood, and the same party that is responsible for setback levies, is that totally consistent?
I'm not quite sure how that would work. I mean, I think the point would be if these are areas where either the Department of Water Resources, in some cases they have a local partner, but so I can think of project levies and other reaches that are part of the project where a local partner proposes a modification of the levee system. Often they do those with support from the state or federal agencies as funders as well. But that evaluation would be carried out by whoever the project sponsor was, and they would need to determine whether the setback was feasible or not.
Okay. I should just tell you, this bothers me. I think I'm going to reluctantly support it. I think we're going to regret carving out large areas of territory not required to study setback levee opportunities, not just for habitat, but for floodplain and flood protection. And the problem with plopping down intense urban development in flood-threatened areas, and I know it was done before, is everyone wants higher protection. The risk to the state, financial exposure, and to the society is substantial, but we don't want to offend people. I understand this will reduce the cost of this regulatory action, and that's fine, but I'll bet you within the next 10 years, the Stewardship Council is going to come back and start imposing more and more need to study for potential setback levies for both flood protection and habitat, primarily for flood protection.
Yeah,
and Dan, I'm not going to argue with you because I'll reluctantly support it, but it just...
I was going to agree with your premise again because I think, and we already have those studies underway that might lead to that because we're identifying, we were already beginning to engage in development of our study to identify priorities for levee investment, and of course the Central Valley Flood Plan will be updated and that'll identify some of those too, and both of those will happen in less than 10 years.
Right. Okay.